Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Chartered Institute of Taxation Conservative Party event. We're here to talk about tax and public finances. My name's Rhiannon Kinghall. I'm head of tax policy at Macfarlanes, a city law firm. I've probably come about this the wrong way. I've actually arrived at conference with a cold, so apologies. But I'm hoping to leave conference without a cold. Hopefully you're also as lucky. So today's conversation is obviously very timely as we hurtle towards the general election. Tax and spending is obviously high on the agenda. I think yesterday I was pushed out of the way by a camera crew chasing after Ian Duncan Smith, asking for his views on tax cuts. So it's obviously very topical at the moment. I'll come on to introductions on the panel in a moment. But I think given the state of public finances, they're obviously quite precarious, and I think there's obviously a lot of uncertainty as we head towards the general election. Is there scope for tax cuts? Is there scope, dare I say it in this room, for even tax rises? I'll say that quietly. And then also the extent of public spending. There's obviously growing demands placed on the state, I think, post-COVID, and some of the influences perhaps from across the Atlantic, from Biden in terms of some of those policies, are obviously growing expectations. But I think the critical point is the economy isn't really growing. So actually being able to reconcile the tax and spend equation is pretty difficult. But luckily, we have a great panel today to discuss that. On my left, I have Paul Johnson, who is the director of the Institute of Fiscal Studies. I have Gary Ashford, who is the CIOT president and also tax partner at Harbottle and Lewis. And at the end, we have Lord Leigh of Hurley, who is a member of the House of Lords and also chair of the House of Lords Economic Subcommittee for the Finance Bill, and is also a chartered tax advisor and chartered accountant. So I think we are in good hands and in for an interesting discussion. In terms of the setup, each of the speakers will share some opening remarks and some reflections. We'll then have a bit of a discussion, and then obviously keen to get your thoughts and open up for a wider discussion with your comments and questions. So without further ado, if I can hand over to Paul to share some reflections on where we are with public finances.
Well, thanks ever so much. Where are we with the public finances? Not somewhere we particularly want to be, I think, is the short answer to that question. We really are in a quite unpleasant place. Taxes, as a fraction of national income, are effectively at their highest level ever, certainly the highest level in peacetime. They've risen from about 34% of national income, which they have been for most of my life, over this Parliament, to about 37% of national income. That's effectively a raise in taxes of about £100 billion a year. And I'll say a little bit more about how we've got there in a minute. So we've got taxes which have risen by more than they have over any similar period, to a level higher than they've ever been. And yet we don't appear to have that much left for spending. If you look at the budget red book, the Chancellor has penciled in 1% a year growth on public service spending for the next, effectively for the next Parliament. When you take account of the fact that health spending will grow faster than that, we have commitments on defence and overseas aid and so on, that looks like small cuts, actually, for most other bits of public services. So how on earth can we be in... And at the same time, debt, as a fraction of national income, is set to stabilise, not even to come down, at getting on for 100% of national income. So we've got high taxes, we don't seem to have much left for spending, and debt is stuck at a very high level. How on earth can that dreadful set of things be true? Well, a series of answers to that. One is that debt interest spending is at close to record highs. Obviously, inflation is high and a lot of our debt is index linked. A lot of our debt is held by the Bank of England, and we pay Bank of England base rate on that, and we've got a lot of debt. So high levels of debt interest spending are a part of the issue. We're actually going to be spending more on debt interest than on any public service other than the health service over the next couple of years. That's the scale of the issue there. Second part of the answer to that question, of course, is poor growth and the economic problems that we've been facing over recent years. Combination of the energy crisis and obviously coming out of COVID have led to higher spending than we might otherwise have done. The third part of the answer, actually rather perhaps surprisingly, is that spending has grown actually quite fast over this Parliament. After a decade of effectively austerity with very little growth in most areas of spending, and indeed cuts in some areas, spending will have grown probably by about 20% in real terms over the period of this Parliament on public services. That's quite substantial growth in spending, and that's not particularly COVID related. That's we're sort of post-COVID now. I'm comparing the beginning of the Parliament to the end. So we have had significant growth in spending over that period. And as I say, put that alongside poor economic growth, and you've got this really difficult period for the public finances going forward. Now, are there ways out of this? I mean, what about, growth might turn out better than expected? Well, the numbers I've just quoted are based on OBR forecasts for growth, which are actually more optimistic than pretty much anyone else's, and partly because they were made back in March before things started to go even more wrong. And actually, if you look at the OBR forecasts over time, despite their reputation as gloomsters and doomsters, actually they have been on average slightly over optimistic rather than over pessimistic over time. My guess is that their growth forecasts will come down a little in the November autumn statement, and some of the public finance numbers might look a bit worse, not least because interest rates are looking higher and inflation is looking higher than they expected back in March. So, of course, it's possible that growth will dig us out of this, but I think the risks are possibly on the downside rather than in the other direction. And actually, there are other elements of those public finance forecasts which, if anything, probably tend towards the optimistic, not least the assumption that fuel duties will rise in line with inflation like they haven't at all since 2010, and corporation tax cuts, which are due to be temporary, will genuinely prove to be temporary, and some other risks to the public finances there. So I'm not sure that we're going to be dug out of this hole by changes in the forecasts. On the tax side, it is worth being clear quite why taxes have risen so far, so what policies have been put in place. And the key thing really is the freezing of personal tax allowances and thresholds, which are now due to be in place for something like, for 6 years, and will raise probably 6 or 7 times as much as was originally expected back in, I think it was March 2021 when those freezes were first announced, partly because they've been extended for another 2 years, but mostly because inflation is much, much higher than was expected back then. And we are going to have record numbers of higher rate taxpayers in particular. So something like, I can't remember the numbers, something like 1 in 6 adults will be a higher rate taxpayer compared with something like 1 in 20 not an awfully long time ago if we carry on down that route. And a large fraction, though not all, of the increases in the personal allowance that were introduced during the coalition government, much of that increase will have gone by the time these freezes run out. So that's by far the biggest tax policy which is raising tax revenue. Obviously, the increase in the corporation tax rate from 19 to 25%, despite the full expensing that's been put in place, will also raise a fair bit of money. And it's worth saying on the corporation tax side, that will take our corporation tax take to among the highest in the OECD. So this is, whilst the headline rate is not especially high still by OECD standards, the take will be pretty high, not at the top, but certainly towards the top of international experience. So there's some big tax rises there. Is there space for tax cuts? That was a question we were asked. I mean, you probably guessed my answer to that, given what I've just said. I don't think there is space for tax cuts unless we can think of some pretty radical changes to the way that we're spending the money. Can we think of really big cuts to the health service, to education, to pensions, to welfare benefits? I mean, there are countries in the world that spend less, particularly outside of Western Europe. There are countries that spend less on public services and on welfare than we do. It's worth saying that relative to Western Europe, we spend less and tax less than most Western European countries. If you look further down the road, what was the biggest fiscal announcement this year, and indeed what was the biggest fiscal announcement of the past arguably decade? It was made 4 or 5 months ago. It was the NHS Workforce Plan. The NHS Workforce Plan, which, my goodness, we needed 70 years late, but we got there in the end. We have an NHS Workforce Plan which says we will be employing 900,000 more people in the NHS by the late 2030s. Just to fund the NHS Workforce Plan will take a tax rise of 2% of national income. So that's about £50 billion in today's term, just to fund the NHS Workforce Plan, nothing else. That is a huge fiscal announcement. Gordon Brown is quoted as saying to Tony Blair in 2001 when Blair announced that he was going to increase NHS funding to the average for Europe, "You stole my effing budget." Well, I think arguably the next 15 effing budgets have been stolen by that workforce plan, if, of course, it is actually followed through. But it is a genuine statement of the likely demand as the population ages and as our expectations grow. Clearly, we'll be spending more on pensions under current policy. The pressure on social care is only going to grow. And despite the increases in spending over the last 5 years, the consequences of that decade of cuts in things like the justice system, prisons, local government and social care are still being felt. So the scope for cuts without some kinds of radical reform strike me as being fairly limited. Last thing I'd say is what I've largely been talking about there is the spending on the day-to-day budget side of things. Spending on investment spending is actually, by UK standards, pretty much at a historic high at the moment. Still below what it is in many of our competitor countries, but again, you look at the budget red book and the projections for this, investment spending is due to fall as a fraction of national income relatively sharply over the next 5 years. Not necessarily a great way of getting growth going. Even if you take Labour's green investment plan, the figures that effectively they're working to would themselves actually overall imply a reduction in overall investment over that period, but a smaller reduction than those implied in the budget red book. The problem here, of course, is that to get growth going, we need consistent policies on things like investment, education, trade, planning, tax, all of those things where we've seen a remarkable lack of consistency over a considerable period of time, and some of those areas where you need upfront investment and upfront costs and long-term gains, which are very hard to do for obvious political reasons. I'll stop there, having cheered you up so much, and hand over.
Thank you. Yes, I was going to say thank you for that cheery start on a Monday morning. I should just add, just on the logistics side, that this event is being recorded. So when we do come to Q&A, you might just want to keep that in mind. I'll pass over to Gary, who I think is going to share some thoughts around the tax gap and whether there's any potential there to find any extra tax revenue.
Thanks, Rhiannon, and thanks, Paul. As Paul has aptly set out, I think he's less than optimistic that there's significant growth coming down the line, I think, and so therefore, if the government or any government is looking to try and find some rabbits out of hats, so to speak, where might they find them? Now, a well-publicised area around taxation probably for the last decade has been this concept of the tax gap. HMRC have more and more invested time and effort into try to calculate what that theoretical tax gap looks like, with all sorts of models. As of today, or the last number of months, I think HMRC would estimate the tax gap round about 4 or 5% of sort of the gross potential theoretical tax receipts, which is round about 35 billion. So possibly, if HMRC were able to close that tax gap, there's 35 billion at stake. Now, clearly no one's going to go from 0 to 100%, but that's the sort of range that we're talking about. Now, I, in my past life, was a former tax investigator for HMRC, so I've got probably about 6 minutes left to try and fix HMRC's system to try and close that tax gap. There's a number of interesting areas within the tax gap that certainly interesting to me. Paul talks about corporate tax rates at the moment, and clearly they have increased, and clearly we've seen over many years now a sort of a regular discussion around the whole avoidance area, and whether that's large, but the contribution of large corporates towards that avoidance area. But if you look at the tax gap, 56% of the theoretical tax gap comes from small business, and so therefore, there's some interesting dynamics in there for government, possibly not palatable to local MPs, because a lot of those constituents perhaps are part of that part of that tax gap. But that is HMRC's numbers. 56% of the 35 billion are linked in some shape or form to small business. So one would say, what can HMRC do about that? Tax gap is not just about fraud. Tax gap is not just about contrived avoidance. Tax gap also, hugely includes mistakes, errors, people not understanding the system. So that always takes you back to that discussion around simplicity. The simpler a tax system is, the easier it is to comply. So, there's always a call out from certainly from all the professional institutes around tax to try and actually make the system simpler, and that would continue today. We've seen over over that last decade, a lot of work has been done by HMRC around that contrived avoidance space. That is probably, there's not huge mileage in that now for HMRC. There are still lots of policies been made around avoidance, and there are new policies in the offering at the moment. I think one of the current ones is to basically create a criminal offence around those who are involved in avoidance and fail to stop to publicise avoidance type schemes, and all of that is it's supported by professional institutes, and it's good housekeeping. But it doesn't necessarily get to the core of that 35 billion. If 1.4 billion is now maybe the estimate of avoidance, 5 billion, the best part of 5 billion is evasion. And so therefore, we probably need to see more activity on the evasion side by HMRC, just at a point when HMRC are, like every other government organisation, losing resource. So there needs to be some discussions, I think, around how are HMRC resourced, and how and what can they do around that tax gap. Clearly, you then get the sort of connection into the digital economy, and how does digital economy feature in there. Now, one of the things we've seen over the last, we've seen this sort of global agreement at large corporate level for international tax avoidance. The base erosion profit shifting sort of discussions, Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. What is certainly hard to estimate, I think, at the moment, would be what would be the contribution, what would BEPS do to the UK economy? It's not currently included within the almost the tax gap figures, I think. So, how in a 2 years' time, what will that tax gap look like if you were to try and incorporate the BEPS deficiencies? But given the fact that 11% of corporate tax or 11% of large business is part of the tax gap, it possibly isn't as large as everyone thinks. And certainly around that, on that international tax avoidance, the current parameters to apply those rules are very high. And so therefore, really, will that make a meaningful difference to things? For me, as someone who's sort of representing the Chartered Institute of Tax, alongside that tax gap is the whole situation of UK PLC. How do we make the UK more dynamic from a taxation perspective? I take on board Paul's views about growth, and I think everyone here is probably a realist. But we do have to still try and make the UK as interesting to foreign investors as it can be, and that's about looking at the economy as it stands today. Can we do more around research and development reliefs? Can we do more around all this of almost incentives that would encourage people to come into the UK? One question I've always got, and I don't know whether Paul can answer it, Lord Leigh can answer it, is we'll always have this discussion around, do you bring down corporate tax rates and what does that do? Is an alternative to that to have a slightly higher tax rate but have great reliefs to actually sort of, do you, by doing that, do you engage the local the community, but then you almost reward them by having massive incentives? And I don't know the answer to that, and I'd be interested to hear other people's views. But certainly I think I've probably run out of my 8 minutes. I haven't fixed the HMRC, but hopefully by the end of today, Lord Leigh might be able to cast some views. Thank you.
Thank you. Some interesting ideas there. I'll hand over to Lord Leigh, who has some further ideas for growth. It wasn't on the agenda, but I'm not sure if this is the starting gun of the rally for growth. I think you're going to stand and share your thoughts. So over to you, Lord Leigh.
Thank you. I thought I'd stand because that way I can't speak for too long, otherwise I'll fall over. Especially after last night when I managed 6 receptions. And then found myself, I don't know if any of you were in the Midland Bar last night, but as party treasurer, I have to look after donors, and one insisted on taking me to the premium whiskey bar, which was a mistake. He then insisted on giving me a shot of tequila, and I was about, fortunately for me, Chris Philp came alongside and said hello. So I said, "Oh, Chris, have a drink." "Oh, thanks very much." Oh. He said, "Yeah, I've got to speak at 8 o'clock. Why me?" And if they repeal every piece of legislation post-1985, I will be able to advise you. I think it's unlikely, so I don't give tax advice, but I do speak in the House of Lords quite regularly on tax, business finance, and particularly tax, partly because there's so few people in the House of Lords who want to or are capable of speaking about tax. So, and in fact, my maiden speech was on BPPS and Pillars 1 and 2, of which more anon. And you can choose your own subject for your maiden speech and choose your own debate, and I chose that debate to speak. And I actually remember it vividly because I was sitting in the bar beforehand with some fellow peers, and they said, "Oh, you've got your maiden speech, good luck. You're not nervous about it, are you? You're used to public speaking." I said, "Well, I'm sort of slightly nervous because, I've never made a speech before without any gags in it." And they said, "Well, what possible gags can you have in a speech about tax?" And I said, "Well, I was going to say tax is like that other 3-letter word ending in X where everybody thinks everybody else has got a much better deal." I said, and one fellow opposite me said, he said, "I think that's rather good," he said. I think you should use that." "Oh," I said, "that's very kind of you. We haven't met." And Lord Leigh of Hurley, "How do you do?" "How do you do?" he said. "I'm the Bishop of London." I didn't use it. So, the background to this is, as Paul has cheered us up so much, is that we're going to hell in a handcart, and that where, of course, the truth is that since 2010, UK's grown faster, I think, than Italy, France, Japan, Germany, and we are very, very high on the FDI charts, investment coming in, and everyone goes on about the poor productivity figures, which I've got great skepticism about productivity figures. They are, of course, output per hour, so don't recognise that we work much longer hours. Perversely, they include in this country the NHS and education, where it's very difficult to get any productivity improvements. And they're based on survey figures. So who the hell's got time to fill in a survey telling the government how hard they're working? So I always rely on actual figures, and the only actual figures that you can really rely on are tax receipts, which is hard cash, and unemployment, which is a hard number. So other than that, the rest I would just making them up as you go along. So I tend to ignore them. But you have to recognise that because of COVID costs and other costs, spending costs, as Paul has alluded to, the government has to find ways of replenishing its reserves. And whilst I'm generally of the low tax and watch it grow school, I am, after all, a product of Margaret Thatcher, and I have a portrait of her in front of my desk, both in my office and in the House of Lords. It only works up to a point, and typically when we're in a position to have low tax. So what can be done to promote growth? It's impossible to cover a whole area in a few minutes I've got, so I just wanted to throw out some pointers, ideas for discussion. I agree with the IFS and where Gary was going, that if you have high tax rates, that's fine, but you have to have deductions. And the IFS have highlighted the annual investment allowance as a great helpful deduction. And I agree with you that it needs to be made permanent. It also needs to be publicised. Not that many people are aware of it, but it's a fantastic way of investing and reducing your tax bill. As the chair mentioned, I chair the Finance Bill subcommittee, and we're having a good hard look at R&D tax credits. Anybody apart from Gary and Paul know what the size of the R&D tax credit was last year? Hazard a guess. Good answer. Anyone want to throw out a number? 6.8 billion. To the point that the HMRC's accounts were qualified, as the auditors said they're not able to determine if that figure is accurate, and they can't tell whether or not how much fraud or error is in that 6.8 billion. So there's a lot to be done in that area, and we're looking at it as our HMRC. So I can live with a 25% corporate tax rate whilst there's that sort of deduction. I am a big fan of the digital services tax, which the Treasury say doesn't work and can't be targeted. It's to tax offshore, to tax online retailers, including offshore retailers. HMT don't like it because they claim it's a John Lewis tax. But actually, the wording does exist to make digital services tax work. And Glyn Fullerlove, former president of the CIOT, and I have come up with that wording for the revenue. So I would like to see that imposed. I'd like to see the OECD BEPS Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 introduced. I think that 15% for every company, every multinational company above a certain size in every country is very, despite being a low tax Tory, is appropriate and should be encouraged. And so am I cutting in and out, or are you all right? The issue I have facing at me at the moment is in respect of the VAT for low consignment goods, which Amazon and Shine are still avoiding despite the 2021 reforms. I'm hoping that the work we've done on the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Bill will stop these sham companies starting up and claiming and consigning goods to the UK through supposedly UK sources. So there is a lot of tightening up that you can do. One area I do want to highlight is EIS, SEIS, and VCTs. Fantastic boost to our economy, but they are still subject to the sunset clause. The Chancellor has stood up and said he will get rid of the sunset clause, but he hasn't enacted them. And the industry is waiting to see what happens on the sunset clause, and I'd like to see at the same time all the restrictions that are put in place by the EU on the EIS and SEIS, because they regard the EIS and SEIS as a state subsidy, are lifted. So it's perverse you can't invest in a company that's over 7 years old. It's perverse you can't invest in a company where your family own more than 30%. These are unnecessary EU state restrictions which, post-Windsor framework, I'm hoping will go. And by the way, has anyone noticed the only reason the Labour Party can put VAT on schools is because the EU restrictions no longer apply? They forgot to mention that. Deviating slightly on to rates, I just wanted to pick up on the IFS proposal of revaluing properties to put higher rates on high-value properties. In fact, there's no need to revalue every property. All you have to do is revalue properties in Band H, of which there are 200,000 in England, about 3 in Wales. No, it's 5,600 in Wales. And just revalue those and put higher bands H, I, J, K, and an enormous source of revenue comes in on these ridiculous properties. How many people in this room know what their council tax rates are? Yeah, well, 20%, 15%? I haven't a clue. And it should be a more meaningful sum. So, drawing to a close, I just, as we're at a political gathering talking about business growth, I do want to mention the effect of the Labour proposal to abolish business property relief on IHT. This has sort of gone unnoticed, and it's going to have a devastating effect. The Quoted Company Alliance has come out with its abhorrence at this idea. It means that if you own shares in a family company and you pass away, your estate has to find 40% in cash on the value of those shares to pass to HMT. And that means that people are going to be forced to sell businesses that they'd otherwise passed from generation to generation. You may have views that intergenerational wealth is a bad thing, but it cannot be a good thing that people are forced to sell regular family businesses because of someone's demise, which could be an early death. And likewise, I want to see Labour's attempt to abolish business, what's called nowadays business asset disposal relief, which is a terrible name, but what we know as entrepreneurs relief. Labour want to get rid of that as well. The whole essence of entrepreneurs starting up a business and growing them is not to take out dividends, which I know IFS calculators how people reward themselves, but it isn't. It's to build up capital in a business and then to sell it. And for the reward of starting a business and taking that risk comes in the capital gain. So to take away the small business exemption is a huge disincentive for entrepreneurs, and it's the entrepreneurs, the SME, the self-starting person we really need to encourage to promote economic growth. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Some interesting ideas. I might just turn to Paul. If the stars were to align on public finances, were there any ideas there that the IFS would maybe endorse, or are there other areas in the tax system that you would look to reform first to encourage growth?
Yeah, plenty. I'd abolish stamp duty as the first. If I had whatever it is, 10 billion to spend on cutting taxes, I'd get rid of stamp duty on particularly on housing transactions for all sorts of reasons, in terms of the impact on the economy and in terms of its impact on labour mobility. So in terms of what we just heard, I agree that making expensing permanent would be a sensible direction. I suspect that we may agree to differ on business asset disposal relief, which is a name that I like. But I actually think I think the main thing I'd say in terms of business taxes, and I'm sure that other people in this room have heard it and think it is the most important thing, is just to have some level of consistency and certainty about where we're going with it. Even talking to business organisations, they're actually much more concerned about having certainty than they are about the exact rate of the tax. And I think the lack of consistency and certainty, and including the sort of we're going to have expensing, but for now only for 3 years, but we hope it will be permanent, as opposed to actually making it permanent, I think is a bigger problem probably than most of the individual aspects of the system.
Thank you. Gary, you touched on HMRC. And I think there have been some concerns that the CIOT has raised in terms of service levels, in particular having an effect on businesses and their ability to get on and do things. Can you share some reflections, and does HMRC need more investment to improve on its service levels?
Well, it's an interesting point. I think the starting point is yes, they probably, and I'm sure if someone was sitting here from HMRC, they'd probably say we'd love some more resource. But the whole dynamic of tax authorities globally is interesting at the moment, and actually it has going back to sort of Lord Leigh's point about R&D is interesting, because the one thing that's changing for all of us, everyone in this room, is the digital economy. Digital economy is massive, both positive and negative in all of our lives. Whether you're a fan of social media, whether you benefit from social media, that's having an impact, but it's also having an impact in business as well. I chair the Chartered Tax Crypto Committee, and so I'm working with with HMRC around tax rules for crypto. But one of the areas that I think HMRC need to be very careful about is beyond things like they have big discussions around things like Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. But if you actually look at the definition of a tax advisor at the moment, what you are finding, and I think this is part of the R&D issue, you're finding lots and lots of new non-tax people are effectively coming into the tax space, with an app or with effectively a website that's providing access to all sorts of things, including R&D relief. And those people, they don't necessarily have the rigour of the professionals. I'm a chartered tax advisor. We've all spent a lot of time, whether it's the ICAW, the Chartered Institute of Tax, introducing sort of regulations, ethical behaviour. So I think HMRC need to be, they need to be possibly a bit more alive to what the definition of a tax advisor is when they're trying to counter tax avoidance. A lot of that tax avoidance nowadays may be coming through a digital channel, as opposed to, they're still very focused on individuals. They're still very focused on tax advisors, when actually the digital economy is going to do brilliant things for this country. But we also have to be alert to the challenges, cybercrime, and even in the tax world, how it's actually challenging the way we do tax.
Thank you. And just a question for Lord Leigh before we open up to questions from the audience. There's obviously, as Paul described, some big challenges with the public finances, and you presented some really good ideas for growth. Is there an opportunity for politicians, though, to have a more honest conversation about the challenges, or are we likely to enter into this general election period sort of ignoring the elephants in the room?
What? Politicians not having an honest conversation with what are you suggesting? Well, I would say this, wouldn't I, as I'm senior chair of the Conservative Party, but I personally think that the approach that Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt have taken has been refreshingly honest and straightforward and determined. And Jeremy Hunt has simply said, I cannot do what I'd like to do. It's just not possible. And he's been straight. And I don't see, I know them both well. They are both Tory tax cutters at heart. And if they could do it, they would. But they're not going to come out with loony ideas. I don't know, but I cannot imagine that they would come up with a proposal to just get rid of inheritance tax. They're not going to do it. They're going to say this is a difficult road. And Sunak in particular, that's his whole training. His whole life has been empirical and based on facts and figures and decisions based not on gut. And it was a big thing for him to leave. Unlike Starmer, he left government because of his views of his boss. And I remember him telling me when he was Chancellor, he said, Boris just keeps promising things I cannot deliver. I cannot find the money to do it. And eventually it was too much for him and he left, which was a huge thing. So personally, I think if anyone can have an honest discussion with the public, I think it's him and Jeremy Hunt.
Thank you. So we'll open up to questions. There is a roving mic. I'm going to try and take a couple of questions, and I'm going to congregate them to say the steps for the roving mic. So I can see two at the front here. So if we start with those two, if you could say your name and where you're from.
Tenny Samuels from Surrey, ex-chairman of a bank, lawyer, notary, God help us. And the thing that worries me is AI. AI, the revenue, need to get hold of AI and start using it for tax collection. I live in America and they're starting to use it there to save a lot of time. What are your opinions, please?
Thank you.
Hi, Andy Watts from Wokingham. I'd like to go to an elephant in the room or in politics, really, but I want to talk about it in a slightly different way. So the elephant being, for most of us, immigration. If you look at mathematically how much it costs to run the UK, it costs probably about £50,000 to £60,000 you need a person to be earning in their working life is roughly break even. Slightly complicated calculation, but it's somewhere around there. I think rather than focus this, because this session's about tax, on the numbers of immigration, what's then clear is we need to really work hard to get those higher end individuals and people into the country. Those are the ones that will pay for everybody else. What can we do through the tax system to really incentivize and become a world leader in attracting those people?
Okay, thank you. Two good questions. Gary, if I could start with you on the AI and whether that's something HMRC could use, and then maybe open up to everyone on the second question.
Well, certainly on the AI, I'm sure you're probably aware that HMRC for a while have used web technology to try and identify people with offshore structures. So, I've sort of sat in one of the sort of the working groups with HMRC probably for the last decade around sort of offshore, the sort of strategy for offshore behaviour, and clearly that's been very. They've been very effective using the internet to find structures that and then understand who the beneficial owners are of those structures. So data. Clearly, there's lots of data out there, and clearly, with the introduction of things like the Common Reporting Standard, the world has become hugely more transparent than it was when we started that project 10 years ago. So a lot of work's been done by the OECD and all the member countries of the OECD to make for a more transparent world. It's not finished, it's not there, but certainly it's significantly more transparent today than it would be a decade ago. Just quickly on the point about this wealthy individuals coming to the country. I used to sit on the board of Tax Advisor Europe for the CIOT, so I know a lot of tax advisors around the world, and clearly. One of the things that will probably come up in this panel is will we scrap the non-dom system? Will the government not scrap the non-dom system? I think the debate needs to be a bit more nuanced than that, because I don't think you can have. It's not a binary thing. If you get rid of the non-dom system, you have to replace it by something else, because you need to attract wealth creators to the UK. And so therefore, when I look at other European countries, they've all got, or certainly a high proportion of them, have got a system to welcome people to the UK. One of the things I see as a tax partner at the moment is wealthy individuals coming to me and saying, I'm thinking about leaving the UK, and that's in part because of tax competition. That's because other countries like Italy, Portugal, number of countries have tax systems that are trying to bring our wealth creators out of the UK into another country. So we have to not necessarily fight back, but it's not a binary discussion, the non-dom discussion. Perhaps we need to reform it, but certainly we can't have no system that attracts wealth people. And it goes back to EIS. So, you must have a competitive country because these people can go anywhere. Sorry. Yeah.
Thank you. Lord Leigh, would you like to comment?
Just briefly, first on the AI, it's not an economic argument, it's a political argument. If you think, which many do, that AI is going to be the defining issue in your life for the next 5 years, who do you want as a leader of your country, Starmer or Sunak?
It's a no-brainer.
Point one. On your point about high earners, you're absolutely right. And the problem is that the Labour policy on non-doms is done because the focus group give it something like 90% approval. And it's completely bonkers shooting ourselves in the foot like this. So it's up to us to go in this room to explain to the world that this is shooting ourselves in the foot. We need non-doms here. They have to have some incentive, or they'll go to Portugal, etc. And it's up to us to find a system that's fair, but encourages them to stay. Because at the moment, as Gary says, they're queuing upside tax offices saying, where do I go?
Thank you. Paul, any thoughts on encouraging high earners to both stay in the UK and come to the UK?
Well, just very briefly, I mean, we already, we are a very open economy. I think, and my colleague Aaron Advani here, who's a real expert on this, has shown that about a third of the top 0.1%, the third of the very highest income people in the country were born abroad. So we bring them in very big numbers, and they contribute very large amounts of tax at the moment. And that's partly or significantly to do with the attraction of London and the City of London and the kinds of industries we have here, which are very global. So we do start from an extremely strong position. Now, exactly how important the tax system is for all of that is quite difficult to determine. But it does mean we are in a risky position, because if large numbers of these people do decide to leave, then the cost to us is very high.
Thank you. We'll open up a few more questions. There's two at the front, and then we'll go towards the back.
Thank you very much. Aubrey Allegretti from The Guardian. I mean, it's sort of been alluded to already, but the politics around this conference in the run-up to the next election is so important, as well as the economics. Liz Truss is obviously kind of holding her growth rally later, and among the things she's asking for is corporation tax to be cut back to what she wanted, which was 19%. I just wonder how feasible you think that is, and how authoritative we should view her sort of economic interventions, be they today or in the run-up to the next election, as she tries to position. Thank you.
One more.
Hello, James from Cooperatives UK. Is it possible to have a system that both has, lots of really well-targeted reliefs that drive really good, business behaviour, and at the same time the degree of simplicity which you also see on?
Thank you. Paul, could I start with you on corporate tax cuts? Is it possible?
Look, we all want lower taxes at nil cost if we could have them, and lower corporate tax is better than higher corporate tax from the point of view of economic growth. And as I said, our corporate tax take is going towards the top end of the distribution. But as we discovered very clearly a year ago, you really cannot cut taxes dramatically without saying how you're going to balance the public finances. So if you are looking at taking corporate tax back down to 19%, which I think would cost in the order of 15 to 20 billion pounds a year, then you have to have some kind of plan as to how you're going to fill that. Now, in a sense, the odd 10 billion out of a budget of $1 trillion is not vast. Were a chancellor to look for 10 billion of tax cuts and find the odd bit of saving on the spending side, maybe some smaller tax increases elsewhere, yes, that's feasible. But if what you want is growth, and I think we all want growth, we kind of know how to do it. We need to invest in education, in particular further and vocational education, and organise that right. We need to liberalise the planning rules. That's difficult politically, but we need to do it. We need to be investing appropriately in infrastructure and housing and rail and road. We know we need to do that, but often we don't. We need a closer trade relationship with the European Union. We know that would be good for growth. We need a tax system which is straightforward as well as competitive, and we fail to reform the tax system in appropriate ways. Look, we kind of know how to get growth, but actually it's politically really difficult, because driving roads through people's back gardens isn't very popular. Building houses next door to people isn't very popular. Spending more, implying more tax on infrastructure and education, isn't very popular. Tax reform that leaves some people worse off isn't very popular. Now, those are the things that we need to do. To simply say what you need to do for growth is to cut tax without any plan for the public finances, that isn't going, certainly by itself, to work.
Thank you. And then just picking up, Gary, on the compromises around having lots of targeted reliefs, and I guess maybe commenting on some of the simplicity in the tax system around that.
I mean, it's a brilliant question. I'm an optimist, and so fundamentally, I think that why not try for it? I would always aim high. It's just about I think we recognise tax as complex, but it's right to ask the question: does it need to be complex? How can we simplify that? But I still think, there's two things for me. Almost going back to the question about rates of tax. I mean, I've been I've been in the profession for 20 odd years since leaving HMRC, and one of the things I've heard for all throughout that time is, if you have very low tax rates, you have a higher level of compliance. Paul may have the answer to this. I'm not sure I've ever seen actually any evidence to confirm that. But what I do know is, when I'm meeting potential clients who are thinking about coming to the UK, they want to hear something positive about the UK tax system. And so that is, whether it's a low rate or whether it's a slightly higher rate with good reliefs, it's trying to give them a good news story. They want to be, in a way, romanced about the UK. And so therefore, the more that you can tell them the UK is a great place to do business, we've got great holding companies rules, great dividend type rules, that's the sort of thing that, foreign businesses, foreign corporations want to hear. When they could easily put that holding company in Amsterdam or somewhere else. Why do we come to the UK? So that's where I think it becomes relevant. But I'm not the economist. Paul is the economist. I certainly don't have a specific view. I think whether it's 19, when it's 25. I think I personally wouldn't want to be above all the competitor countries. But I'm definitely not the economist in that.
We've got some questions over this side. So, lady here at the front, and another lady just halfway down.
Do you think we could do more with our tax system to address the intergenerational inequality without necessarily cutting tax and the overall income we receive from tax, but to improve the mood music? So, for example, I've always been interested in why we can't give a income tax rate cut to landlords who are prepared to let for a 7-year term, so that the people who are stuck, unable to get on the housing market, can at least have security of tenure while their children are at school. Likewise, cuts to inheritance tax, could we link that somehow to social care? So we're not putting, if we're going to talk about cutting inheritance tax, we're tying it in, well, yeah, you're going to at least have to push forward these changes to social care that are otherwise falling a huge burden on the next generation and are really putting off the next generation of Conservative voters.
Thank you. And then just one more question halfway.
Hiya. It was just in relation to Gary's point on HMRC and the tax gap and small businesses. And a lot of this, I guess, comes down to tax administration rather than tax policy. So do you think HMRC's Making Tax Digital programme is fit for purpose in helping to significantly close that tax gap? And I guess especially given tax authorities around the world have come on leaps and bounds, in relation to tax administration with things like real-time reporting and e-invoicing, whilst HMRC have spent the last kind of several years trying to roll that programme out.
Can you just say name and where you're from? Sorry.
Missed that bit. So, Jess Jensen from Sage UK.
Thank you. Lord Leigh, can I bring you in on the first question around the tax system and encouraging intergenerational fairness with any discussions around tax cuts?
Yeah, I mean, it actually ties into the question over there, which is that you have all these brilliant ideas, but the complexity that it leads to means that asking these guys that sort of question is totally unfair, because without a complicated tax system, they're not going to make a living. So they want it as complicated as possible. Whereas the one answer I had I thought did work was to increase council taxes on big homes where people are, one person in a family mansion. I think you can easily put up council tax rates without any bureaucracy, and that would help intergenerational movement, because the people will sell homes and they'll make it easier. That's the easy one I can think. We did look at Make Tax Digital at the Finance Bill Select Committee, and we managed to persuade the Revenue to put it back because they weren't ready. Whether or not they're ready now, I'm not sure they are. I think they are a bit behind. And I don't want to fall into the Guardian's luring invitation to do another blue-on-blue attack. But I think Paul's response was brilliant, as usual, if I may say so. And I'd simply say to them that look what happened when Kwasi Kwarteng tried to reduce the top rate of tax. To everyone's astonishment, nobody wanted it. Everyone thought it was inappropriate. So it isn't always the answer just to drop the top rates of tax without knowing how or why or what. Even most Tories didn't want it. So I'm not quite sure what they're banging on about.
Thank you. And Gary, maybe could you just touch on tax administration?
I mean, I think Lauren Leigh sort of almost put the nail on the head. I think it's always important. There's nothing magic about tax on this point. Actually, it goes back to that point about the digital economy that this gentleman talked about, AI. There's nothing magic about this. It won't solve every problem. It won't make everything bad in the world. It's about how you actually harness it. The one challenge I would have of HMRC is, are they harnessing it properly? And so therefore, I think it was right that you asked them to hang back a little, because certainly, I think, the CIOT, we've been quite public in the fact that HMRC service standards aren't quite where we'd like them to be at the moment, and that's affecting businesses and taxpayers around the country. People aren't getting answers, and people aren't getting tax refunds, and now those tax refunds could be the difference between a business surviving and a business failing. And digital's part of that, because there's definitely a focus on building this digital tax system. But it can't be at the expense of everything else. And I think any of us who have ever been involved in any sort of computer program in any of our businesses have always realised that a computer takes longer than you ever imagine and costs an awful lot more money than you probably ever imagined as well. And so therefore, it's making sure there's that realism when anyone's embarking on what's always a very ambitious thing to do, really.
Thank you. We'll maybe go to last questions. I think there's a few just at the back. There's a gentleman I can see over there, right at the very back, sorry.
Thank you. John McLaren, economist. I want to go back to the issue of GDP growth. I mean, without GDP growth, we're going to struggle to raise taxes and to be able to cut taxes further forward. And GDP growth, along with productivity, if you believe productivity figures, has struggled since the financial downturn. But there's also, compared to the end of the 20th century, where there were tailwinds improving growth from more women's participation in the economy, from improved education, more people going to university, and from better demographics. Now we've got all those flipped over, so there's no improvement in the first two anymore, and you've got an aging economy. So the likely growth rate is going to be lower anyway, which then takes you back to just productivity and improving that. And that, as Paul outlined some of the ways to improve growth, and those are also through improving productivity. But if you don't address that, I just can't see how you're going to be able to cut taxes. It's not easy, it is long term. But at the minute, tax cuts seem just a fantasy.
Thank you. And then I think there was another question while the mic's at the back, just on the other side, and then we'll take last question here at the front, and hopefully that will wrap things up.
Yes, hi, Campbell Murdoch of Total Energies. I heard the panel say that businesses want a certain future for tax so far as possible, and that is definitely the case. However, if you have a discussion with Treasury, they always say we cannot bind future parliaments. So if you were looking for a contractual solution for strategic investment, which I think we should be considering, the Treasury seemed to be reticent in providing a solution. So I just wondered if the panel had any views on that.
Thank you. And then final question, sorry, just at the very front, and then that's the last one. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hopefully wraps up a few other things. Paul Swinney from the think tank Centre for Cities. So it doesn't look like we're going to really cut tax. We had lots of questions about intergenerational distribution. Should we now, does that then mean that we should change the triple lock?
Thank you. So taking the first question, Paul, the question around are we expecting too much, too optimistic around growth, and therefore our expectations for tax cuts?
Well, I mean, as I said at the beginning, I don't think there's going to be space for tax cuts. It's not just the immediate pressures that we're seeing in the public finances, but we know that we're going to be needing to spend more on health and pensions, social care and everything going forward as a result of demographic change. So I think the chances of tax cuts are very remote. As I said, taxes have grown for a very long time. Tax have been 34% of national income. And that's despite the fact we spent more on health and welfare over that period. And that's partly because we slashed defence spending to 2% of national income. It's partly because we've had a decade of austerity through the 2010s. If you look at other bits of history, we've kind of got out of nationalised industries. We've sort of privatised some higher education funding. It's going to need something along that scale to prevent taxes going up from here. And I don't know what that would be. So I think that's where we are. Just a couple of other reflections on the intergenerational issue. In terms of the triple lock, look, I think it's perfectly reasonable to say we want a state pension which is higher than it is at the moment. I think it's a political decision which I don't have a particularly strong view about as to whether we want a higher pension or not. I think it'd be very good if the parties could say it's currently about 25% of average income. Where do we want it to be? Do we want it to be at 28, 30, 33, and then aim to get there and then stop? And the triple lock is a very random way of getting there. We just don't know when it will be there. But I think having an aim for where we want the pension to be is absolutely reasonable. In terms of the sort of broad role of the tax system in intergenerational equity, look, there are lots of things to do. Certainly reforming council tax. There was something I saw on social media the other day which just showed a picture of a $36 million house somewhere in the US, saying there's $100,000 of property tax a year on that, and a £250 million house in London on which there's £3,000 property tax. There are still houses in Westminster and Chelsea and so on which pay less in council tax in nominal terms than they did in rates back in 1990, and that's just ludicrous. As I said, getting rid of stamp duty would also help with moving the housing market. And don't forget that we tax unearned income much less heavily than earned income because we don't have a national insurance on top of that. And I think we could think quite seriously about changing that.
Thank you. Gary, could I bring you in on the question around stability in the tax system and whether some sort of contractual solution might be the way forward?
I mean, it's interesting, actually. I mean, certainly, Lord Leigh's the sort of, the politician in the room, and I suspect politicians are not going to want to be bound by previous administrations. But I do wonder whether, HMRC being empowered to enter into some sort of agreement that will last beyond a certain period of time for the benefit of business, is certainly an interesting proposition, and I could, on a personal level, I think that could be something worth exploring. But I don't think governmentally, and I'm not the expert, that a government's is going to want to be held to account for a 5-year period over something because of X, Y, and Z. It's a political decision. I mean, they've done it for other things that possible, but clearly anything that can be done to give business some stability, one would say must be a good thing.
Lord Leigh, can I bring you in for some final reflections?
Yeah, on the question about productivity and growth, I'm much more optimistic than you. I take your point that the tailwinds that we've had have been exceptional and one-off. But I go around factories quite often in my day job. I remember going around one very recently, and there was literally a fellow who, needless to say, he was East European, and he was paid very little, and his job was lifting a box from one production line to the other production line. And that was it. He was literally all day moving it. And I said to the owner, well, why is that not mechanised? And he said, well, it's just cheaper to pay this guy. That's all changing. Quite rightly, minimum wage is going up. And I see an enormous increase in productivity, not just in the factories, but through AI. And AI will lead to massive increases in productivity for every industry. So I believe that there will be growth and increase in productivity leading to lower taxes if we have the right government enabling people to take advantage of them. I mean, 'cause you're right about the triple lock, of course, Paul, but politically I just cannot see a government going into an election with anything other than a commitment to keep it, sadly. And of course, you're right about the governments not binding subsequent governments, which has its pluses and minuses, but that's just how Parliament works. We've just got through 38 bills in the last Parliament. The King's speech is coming on the 7th of November. Please God, there's not another 38 bills, otherwise I'll never see my family. But can I just, if I am ending, thank the CIOT for all you do, and the IFS. I can tell you, for those who are here as supporters of CIOT, parliamentarians really do rely on them for information, help and advice when speaking in debates and changing legislation. So thank you to them and to all their supporters.
Thank you. And just like to say thank you very much to my panel, to Paul, to Gary, and to Lord Leigh. And on behalf of the IFS and CIOT, thank you all for coming today and raising some interesting questions. I hope you have a good day. Thank you. Bye-bye.